This is TWiT.
Top of the news you couldn't avoid it this week. This has been the week that Zuckerberg built. And by built, I mean he went to Washington, sat in front of the highest public scrutiny, and walked away from it relatively unscathed. On Tuesday, Mark Zuckerberg sat in front of the House. On Wednesday, in front of the Senate. I may have got that backwards, but anyways, to defend Facebook's business practices on the record. David McCabe was at the two-day hearing, covering the hearing for the full event for Axios. And David's actually here to talk to us all about it. Welcome, David.
It's a pleasure to be back.
Yeah, we're really excited to get you on here, and a little bit jealous that you got to be under all of those, those bright lights in the throngs of press. That I always see these pictures when someone's, in front of the whole hearing, and you see just that wall of press that has the cameras pointed at them. That's a lot of pressure.
It was a lot. Well, the cameras were quite some. The number of photojournalists there who all did excellent work coming out of it was immense. But yeah, it's a ton of press attention for Mark Zuckerberg, as well as, just tons of members of the public who wanted to see him testify. So I think if you didn't know before that there was going to be a lot of interest in it, the minute he walked into the room and saw walls on walls of reporters, you can see it in that photo there a little bit, saw all the photographers, heard all the clicks, it was obvious that this was going to be very, very closely watched.
I'm sure he had a little bit of an inkling that it was going to be that crazy, but he sat through a lot throughout. You were in the room to watch it all. So from your in-person perspective, like how did it seem like he was handling all that pressure? A lot of us were able to follow on TV, but it's another thing to actually be there. What did you think from that perspective?
He, of course, has this reputation for being a little robotic at times, sometimes a little uncomfortable with the sort of interview type setting. Obviously, everyone has seen The Social Network, which sort of put this in the pop culture narrative. But he actually came across most of the time as pretty calm and collected, especially in the Senate hearing, as he was sort of faced with these pretty basic questions. You could sort of tell that he was on very, very comfortable ground. For him in the House, he was a little more noticeably rattled when he was interrupted a couple times, or that a lot of lawmakers like to do this thing where they say, I have a question you can only answer with yes or no.
Right.
So, will you change your business model? Yes or no, sir? And he responds, well, that's complex. And they say yes or no, right? So he was a little rattled by those exchanges, but generally speaking, pretty calm and collected, and I think more so than at least some people expected going in, given his public reputation.
David, I was at NAB when this was all happening, and it was interesting because the number of booths that had at least one monitor that was tuned to the hearing in some way, shape, or form. They were streaming something. So there was definitely a lot of interest in the broadcast world about how he was handling this. And the comment that I heard echoed through the halls was he knows who his audience is. And his audience, actually, it's not the Senate and it's not the House. He's actually speaking to a different demographic. He's speaking to the American people. Did you get that sense that this is just more of the Mark Zuckerberg apology tour?
Well, I think you got the sense he was playing to both a little bit in the room. Certainly, he was very aware of kind of the way you respond to a lawmaker. Right. Traditionally, CEOs before Congress try not to be defiant. They try not to be condescending. You could tell he was really aware of that, but he was absolutely also aware that anything he said was on TV and also could end up being replayed over and over on YouTube, on television, and that his users, that the American people would see that. So I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah, there weren't, we've seen this written about, there really weren't any air quotes viral moments, which is really actually something that's kind of impressive to say, considering he was under so much scrutiny and there was so much, it was so heavily weighted, just the amount of pressure of people watching, looking for any of those moments to be able to point to and say, aha, we finally caught Zuckerberg or Facebook admitting to something or whatever. You really didn't get that. What we did hear from Zuckerberg, it seemed like, and he repeated this throughout both days, is that Facebook as a whole is open to or has some sort of expectation that there will at some point be regulation. Do we have any sense of what kind of regulation Facebook might be okay with? If they're saying that they assume that it's going to happen, then they're opening that door. Are they going to be, is Facebook going to be, I don't know, sad that they open that door at some point? Like, are they opening the door to something that could be just much larger than they're ready for?
Well, I think that his testimony was pretty careful not to say I'm open to any and all regulation, but that he kept saying, well, I'm not the kind of person who thinks that all regulation is bad regulation. He particularly pointed to the idea that you could codify into law sort of making the terms of service for these sites easier to read and understand, and some other kind of vague suggestions. But he pushed back significantly and avoided significantly committing to any sort of like opt-in requirement, saying that, you have to get a user's affirmative permission to use their data. That was something that made him kind of seemingly uncomfortable. So I think we saw both that there are types of regulation they may be open to, but there are things that they absolutely did not want to open the door to formally.
Yeah.
David, I want to talk a little bit about competition, because it is striking that he really couldn't name a competitor in the same space as Facebook. But I found even more interesting the fact that he was able to keep Instagram out of the conversation. As much as possible, he took pains to make sure that they weren't equating Instagram with Facebook. They weren't going to look at Instagram the same way they were looking at Facebook. Is that part of his strategy? He understands that there's regulation coming. He knows that Facebook membership is declining a little bit in that very important 25 or so demographic. Is Instagram sort of the parachute for him in case this goes the wrong way?
Well, I think we've certainly seen Facebook invest in Instagram and WhatsApp as a way to make sure that they're sort of on the bleeding edge of how people communicate. As for the fact that it didn't come up much, I think it's very telling that he kept citing this study that says, well, people use 8 apps to communicate on average when asked about the competition concerns and competition questions around Facebook. And I saw some reporting from someone at the Washington Post that said that actually 4 of those apps, or 3 or 4 of those apps, are apps that are owned by Facebook. Now, they're different services. People use them differently. But certainly, he didn't get into, or lawmakers didn't bring him into really conversations about how Facebook's market share is not just Facebook, the Facebook platform, it's Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, and Messenger.
Do you think that's just because they didn't understand, they didn't know that, their interns didn't prepare them for that, or were they just so focused on Facebook and getting their points in front of the press?
I think that there weren't that many exchanges about competition, and they were fairly high level. One was one between Lindsey Graham and Zuckerberg, where Lindsey Graham said, "Do you think you're a monopoly?" And he said, "Well, it certainly doesn't feel that way," to some laughter. But I think they just didn't go that far into depth. In depth, they did talk a bit about Messenger data collection and WhatsApp data collection. So the services did come up, but in terms of what they mean for the market question, they just never really got there. And I think part of that was that so much of the hearings were focused on privacy, the competition and antitrust was sort of a sideline.
Yeah, and I mean, if you watch both days, there was a high focus, big focus on what you're talking about there. It also touched on some of the other scandals is the wrong word, but some of the other kind of points of focus that we've heard over the years. One of those being this concern that Facebook and probably the larger Silicon Valley tech community at large is in some ways operating their business with some sort of political motivation behind it. Possibly, they mentioned censorship of conservative views. Zuckerberg talked a little bit about that. Were you convinced with what you heard? Like, I know that there were some people who were questioning Zuckerberg that felt pretty confident that there was some sort of political motivation behind some decisions behind the scenes. Do you think he did a fair job answering that?
I think that's something that came up many, many times. Clearly, a lot of Republicans concerned about that, or more concerned about that than they were about Cambridge Analytica, which obviously taps into some Republican politics.
Right.
I think his answer was essentially the same every time. It was, I care a lot about this, and we don't do it. We don't, engage in bias, distribution based on bias. Whether lawmakers came away from that totally convinced, I think, remains to be seen. My guess is, I've been covering Facebook in Washington now for several years, and these controversies around the suppression of political views, particularly conservative views, tend to pop up with some regularity. So I'm not sure that anything he said will stave that off, given that it's just essentially what the company's been saying for years and more. More scandals have always come up. This time it was the limiting reach of a video duo called Diamond and Silk, who support the president. We heard about Diamond and Silk a lot in the hearing rooms, and so I think it remains to be seen. But if history is any guide, him just saying we don't do it probably won't stop the next controversy from coming apart.
Speaking of that controversy, the next controversy, there's actually going to be most likely a separate hearing for the Cambridge Analytica issue. This seemed more like a tongue lashing. This was Mark Zuckerberg getting pulled in front of the refs and essentially being told, bad, don't do this again. Do you expect a different tenor for the Cambridge Analytica hearing? Because that sounds like something that they can actually really drag people to the carpet on and perhaps come up with some regulation, some sort of plan of action, versus this, which was just, okay, we've shown you that we were hard on Facebook.
Yeah, I mean, the Cambridge Analytica hearing will be pretty heated. My guess would be, it remains to be seen exactly what that will look like. But obviously, Democrats are very interested in the Trump angle on Cambridge Analytica, the relationship with Bannon, with the Mercers, and I don't think they will hold back on that. That obviously complicates Republicans' concerns, but also Republicans share a lot of the data privacy concerns. So I would imagine, given that Cambridge is sort of the source of all of this angst, that they are at the center of this privacy scandal, that it will be a significantly heated hearing. Whether or not that spurs regulation, I think, is a question it's hard to answer until lawmakers hear what they hear and then come out and say, this is how it influenced me.
Yeah, not just Cambridge Analytica, in a separate hearing. I would imagine we're probably going to, at some point, see more of this with other tech CEOs facing similar scrutiny. It seems like the lights are on, as far as this issue is concerned, and there's a lot of attention to it. In the end, at the end of the day, or the 2 days rather, what would you say were the most pressing unanswered questions? What are the things that we hoped to hear that we didn't get any indication of?
I think we did not hear a great explanation of how they came to the decision not to notify users about this Cambridge Analytica data leak. We heard again and again sort of what they decided and the why they decided, but we didn't really hear a lot about the how, who was in the room. He was asked, were you in a conversation about the decision not to tell users? And he said, I don't remember that conversation. He actually corrected himself. He said, well, we couldn't ban Cambridge Analytica because they weren't on our platform. And then he said, well, actually they were. I didn't give you the right answer. And sort of stunningly, no lawmaker asked the question again. Why didn't you ban them? So I think we didn't get a great answer of how at the highest levels of Facebook or the highest levels that the scandal reached, this played out. And I'll be curious to see if that is a question that we get answers to in the future.
Sure.
David, I'm just interested in some last thoughts here. What kind of grade would you give Facebook in general and specifically Zuckerberg? Looking at his performance in front of the Senate, in front of the House, how does this play out?
Well, I think we did not see the needle move much on regulation, as we wrote on Axios this morning. And that is because, there wasn't one major gaffe or one mistake that really pushed particularly Republican lawmakers to say, well, we have to overcome our traditional aversion to regulation. We have to speed ahead of the process. So essentially, they're where they were before, which is to say, we're concerned regulation may be necessary, but not to outright say, here's what we're doing and here's when we're doing it. And that was also aided by the fact that there was no real idea that they coalesced around in terms of, well, if we're going to regulate Facebook, this is what it looks like. We may see that happen in the coming days. I'm sure that staff members are vetting the proposals that are out there, writing their own, but they're not at that place yet.
Awesome stuff. David McCabe with Axios, axios.com. David, where can people follow you online if they want to find your work?
They can follow me at @dmccabe on Twitter.
Right on. David, thank you so much for taking time to talk to us about this today. And I'm sure we'll see you in the background during the Cambridge Analytica hearing as well.
I might not get as good a seat again. They assign those out, and so we'll see. But it's always great to join you, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. We'll have you again back soon. Thank you again.